Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing a review of The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. So this is a book that is a recent release for Tor Fantasy Books. I believe it came out in February. Let me talk a little bit about the characters and then I'll kind of get into how the plot works. So the book basically follows Kasorwe. She is a priestess, she's an orc, and she's about 14. So she's living in the House of Silence, where the book basically opens up with her meeting Belthandros, whose name she doesn't know at the moment, but it's basically he's a mage that goes to her to get a reading or prophecy of sorts from the unspoken god. And the way that they do that is that she takes a lotus and the god prophesizes through her, basically. That's somewhat of how the magic structure works throughout the book, but I'll get into that as I go forward. So in this House of Silence, we also meet Orana, who is another orc, and she is the librarian at the House of Silence. She and Belthandros have this kind of we don't know if it's like a love relationship or if it's a scholarly one, but anyway, I digress. They have something going on. The reason I mention it is because she comes up again. The reason I mention it is because she comes up again later in the book. So at this point, Belthandros basically convinces Kasorwe to go with her instead of being sacrificed to the unspoken god, which is essentially the normal trajectory of how her life would have worked. And so she does. I realize I'm explaining this very matter-of-factly, but honestly, to some extent, it pretty much happens this way in the book. Everything I'm describing so far is about the first 2 chapters. So when they're together, they develop this kind of I don't want to say father-daughter relationship because I don't think that they lead you to believe that. I think it's more of a scholar and mentor type relationship. But basically he basically starts to take care of her, and they live in Greyhook for 3 years, where she basically learns both languages and the sword, and she basically trains herself to be the sword of Belthandros. So he is from this place called Planthothe, and that is the eventual goal. It's understood that if she is going to go with him, she is going to help him regain his throne. And really, the way that she feels for the most part is you get a very 14 or very adolescent view of the world kind of a thing. And there's not a lot, she doesn't question many of those things. She feels like because he saved her life, it's understandable that she owes these things to him. So they, at this point, most of what I'm actually talking about happens all in part 1. Part 1 is maybe the first, it's about a 400-page book all the way through. I think it's 400 and give or take 420 pages, around 400 pages. But the first part of it is basically maybe the first 100 pages, and then it kind of stops. So part 2 moves into they actually make it to Planthothe. They have a couple of side quests, and let me kind of go into the travel. The way that they travel in this world is through these portals, pretty much. It seems like they use ships. They use a lot of ship terms, so I'm assuming it's a ship. But one of my issues with the book was that I never fully understood how they actually went about traveling. They use alchemical engines, so I assume that it's some type of space boat travel. That may or may not be right. But in this space boat travel situation, and actually one of the coolest things about the book is the way that they travel. It's essentially saying that they basically travel through this black maze that is caused by something called the corruption. And from what I understand, the corruption is exactly that. It basically goes into these worlds and destroys them. And in this process, it creates these mazes that allow them to travel. If that didn't make sense, you understand where I'm at. Anyway, so in one of these, in doing this travel, they go on this like side quest before they go back to Llanfydd. I don't even remember what happens in the side quest. It literally matters not at all to the story. So they go on some quests. They make it there, and Belthandros basically wants Casorwe to infiltrate this castle and figure out a way for him to get in. So he assumes that in her 3 years of training, she is ready to do this. It doesn't particularly go super well for her, but during this time, she basically meets Talisaries, and Talisaries later becomes her brotherly, co-workery companion. They have like a brother-sister kind of fighty relationship, or like a love-hate relationship for sure, but there's definitely no love in between the two of them. I say that because there's a lot of love-ish things going on in the book. So basically, she ends up, bad stuff happens to her in this place, but she ends up making it. She makes it out, and she's able to find a way for Belthandros to make it back into the city. Some time passes. This is actually where the cover of the book, she gets, because of what takes place here, she sort of, let's go and sticks her neck out for Belthandros because she feels indebted to him for everything he's done for her. And during this time, we find out that he gives her a gold tusk, which she feels very grateful for, because at this point, there's been zero magic so far. And they talk about it in a way of like, magic, even using a little bit of magic is kind of a huge thing. And he does that for her. So we go into the next part of the book, which is 5 years later. And literally it just jumps to 5 years later, where basically Casorwe and Talisaries, he goes by Tal, start doing these missions, basically these like recon missions. And they're trying to find this special artifact, which is the Reliquary of Pentrevese. And that is ultimately what at the beginning of the book, where Belthandros goes to the House of Silence, that is what he asks for. So basically his entire mission in life is to find this artifact. That's basically what the large focus of the book is. We find out. We don't find this out until almost the third part. But in doing this, they run into Orana again. They also run into another character named Shuthmili. She is, okay, so let me kind of go back a little bit. I don't think that every character in this book, this book was kind of marketed as a story of orcs. And while I believe Casorwe is an orc, I don't think everyone in these worlds are solely orcs. I believe that Belthandros is potentially a human character or an elf. I actually think he might be an elf. I also think Talisaries is an elf as well. I think Shuthmili, I don't think Belthandros is a human. I think Belthandros is an elf. I think Shuthmili is a human. The author doesn't necessarily get into too much of physical description of any of the characters, I felt, but just based on little things here and there, I kind of have pieced together that that's what I believe, at least. That's the way I interpreted it, as they were all these, different races. Anyway, so they meet Shuthmili, and her god is the traitor god. So her type of magic is, they have to be very careful with it because her god can come through her, essentially. Whereas the other ones, not so much. Okay, so I talked about Shuthmili's magic structure. I don't know if I talked about the magic structure before. Oh yeah, I talked about the lotus. So everyone kind of has the way that the magic structure works, it seems like each of the gods has a patron, and through different methods, the god essentially goes through the patron, and it affects them physically differently, but it's taxing on the body physically for everyone that does magic, basically. So moving forward to where they pick up Shuthmili, basically, Casorwe ends up having a decision where she runs into Orana, who has the reliquary, and potentially saving Shuthmili. She ends up picking Shuthmili. They end up back in Llanfydd with a very disappointed Belthandros. At this point, basically, the entire focus of the book, so, literally, Casorwe completely does 100% 180 and totally changes. She is aggressively upset that she saved Shuthmili and didn't get the reliquary, so now she feels that she has to make up for that. And then The people that are the police, sort of Karsaj, where Shukmili is from, come and get her, and they're the Quincuriate. Her aunt, they basically send her aunt, who is like one of the head Quincuriates, and they basically come to retrieve her. She goes back with them. Kasorwe then struggles at that point to the fact that she just like lets Shukmili go with them after having saved her, because she feels like Shukmili was somewhat in the same situation as her, where she was going to be sacrificed. Shukmili was in some ways going to lose her existence when she joined what she needed to do for her type of magic. So Kasorwe basically intervenes and is like, no girl, let me tell you what's gonna happen to you. And then straight up abandons her. So basically the rest of the book is Kasorwe kind of making up for all of those things. That's how it ends. I don't want to necessarily get too much into the rest because it's going to be super strong spoilers. Okay, so that's a recap of the book, basically. Some plus or some of the negative thoughts I felt were, I thought that there was little to no character development. I think it is a super action-packed story, as in there's constant, or not necessarily constant action, but it's very fast paced because they're constantly doing something else. They're moving to a different place. They're doing something. They're always doing something, rather. But because there was such a lack of character development, I didn't feel like I cared enough about any one of the characters to care about any of the actions taking place. So the very first part where Belthandros and Kasorwe are kind of, or Kasorwe is sort of trying to figure out her life after the House of Silence with Belthandros, that to me was the most interesting, most engaging part of the entire book, and it pretty much ended in 100 pages. I no longer, because it moved so quickly, it didn't give me a reason to care about anything that was taking place. And let me tell you, there are some things that are supposedly pretty decent reveals going forward. Like there's some things that are kind of interesting or surprising. I didn't find them in any way interesting or surprising, and frankly, I didn't care enough about any of these characters to care about any of those anyway. Everything was answered. Yeah, it was answered well, and everything concluded and ended. But there was just such a lack of description in everything. The world building I felt was very lacking because of, like I said, I couldn't even explain necessarily how they travel appropriately. We move constantly through so many different things that I feel like we didn't get a full picture of any one world or any one character. So that was kind of a disappointment for me. Also, this is it technically is a love story, and of all things, and okay, first off, this is not a negative on love stories. I am a sucker for love stories. Give me a good love story in any capacity. I don't care. I'm in. I was excited for an LGBTQ plus representation book where I was hoping for a good love story. I felt like this had representation without a very good love story. I was kind of frustrated with it because after I liked the first part so much and then it just completely changed, I really, really lost a lot of interest, and I thought it was kind of a little bit difficult to get through. There's a pronunciation guide at the beginning, I believe, so I didn't find the names to be difficult, but I will say I read half of it, I listened to half of it, and the only reason that I listened to it is, well, I had other things going on, so it worked for my lifestyle, but also, I was just so bored with it that I kind of found it a little bit difficult to focus towards the end, which I found frustrating because they had some really interesting, cool parts at the end that I wish I cared more about. So yeah, so for me, this was a 2-star read. Go pick it up if it's something that sounds interesting to you. You might have a completely different opinion than me. It's something that you don't necessarily see a lot of, and it felt kind of like maybe like a World of Warcraft style fantasy, which for some people I think they might be super into. It was a fast read. It definitely was transportive if you're looking for something that's going to be completely, that's going to totally take you out of where you are or take you to a different, take you to a different place. I think this one will definitely satisfy that for you. It just wasn't really my cup of tea. To be honest, it probably would have been a DNF or I would have not finished it. I would have just set it down if it wasn't something that my boyfriend and I were reading together, or not so much reading together, but we were both reading concurrently. And I don't think enjoyed it. I think he enjoyed it more than I did. Like he would read another one by the author. I don't know that I necessarily would. It just, for me, just wasn't my choice. Anyway, that's my review of A.K. Larkwood's The Unspoken Name. If it's something you want to check out and you completely have a different opinion, please let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. Thanks, guys.